I'm Tōsh. I'm a DJ and producer here in San Francisco, and welcome to The Issues. Today's issue, the first one, is about a topic called live coding. And we have with us today Dan, who has been part of the live coding scene in New York City for quite a while and has just moved to San Francisco, and we're happy to have him performing at Saturday's event. And he's here to talk to us about live coding. Dan, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, cool. Thanks for having me here. My name's Dan Gorelick, and I've been in the live coding scene in New York. I'm a musician by training. I grew up playing classical cello, but recently I've been getting into electronic music, and one of the ways that I make electronic music is with code. So yeah, I'm excited to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your journey. You started from classical music into electronic music and then into music with code. It seems like quite a big journey from a very analog way of making music to a very digital way of making music. How does that feel to you?
Yeah, no, great question. I started with classical cello, and with the cello, it's very much about how can I make this instrument, this wooden instrument, make any sound. And it takes a lot of training to get the bow to go on the strings and make anything that sounds musical. And then you have the notes, you have the intonation. And it wasn't until, I think after I graduated college that I discovered synthesizers. And not only is it playing the right notes, but it's also shaping sounds in very new ways that I wasn't used to. And I think from synthesizers, that's when I realized that Ableton is a thing and that DAWs are a thing, and that this kind of opened my world up to creating music in all these new ways. And how I landed with live coding is that I've been doing a lot of software engineering. I'm a creative technologist by day, so I do lots of different creative engineering projects that involve creative coding. And part of my community in New York is very focused on how can we make art, both music and visuals, with code. So something I've been using is a tool called Title Cycles, and it makes it very easy to make patterns and actualize a lot of the musical ideas very quickly. Yeah, that's kind of my journey here.
Cool. I'd love to hear you talk about some of the pros and cons of making music with instruments, which is, at least for me, feels like a very physical act, versus with code or synthesizers, it feels like a much more intellectual act. I'm curious to hear how you think about the trade-offs between the two.
Yeah, I think that playing live music, for me, I think there's two camps. There's clock-based music and there's non-clock-based music. And I think that, there's probably more camps than that. But for me, if I'm playing cello and I'm in a quartet, we're playing chamber music or we're playing jazz or whatever kind of music, it's very much, we kind of feel the beat, we feel the pulse. We can speed up, we can vary. We might have a metronome, but typically we kind of try to keep the tempo on your own. And it's similar with rock music if you have a drummer going. But once you enter the world of electronic music, that's where you might be using a metronome. You might have a drum machine that's keeping you in time. And I think both are very intellectual. I think that with electronic music, I think it's very much, I think for me, learning that I could make dancey fun music was kind of like this fun, like alternate ego that I never got to explore when doing classical music and jazz. And for me, it's just like so different hitting a button and having this drum kit going, like having the 808 just doing its thing. And then on top of that, either typing in with the arpeggiator, typing in the synthesizer notes, or just playing the synthesizer notes, versus soloing. And I think that when I solo, it's not clock-based, and that's when you can kind of play with the clock and you can kind of go around it. And I think a lot of beautiful things happen when you combine the clock-based with the live music. So, yeah.
And in a lot of your performances, you do use live coding plus a synth that you're playing on the spot, or other sorts of Ableton plus actual instruments that you're performing on.
Totally, yeah. And to get to the pros and cons of live coding, it's very much a clock-based system, and it's very much things are being played on the meter. You can add some swing to spice it up a little bit, but at the end of the day, you're still going to be tied to the clock. And so typically for my sets, what I do is I have my live coding do the drums. It can send signals via MIDI, and it'll also even send MIDI signals to the synthesizer. And it's a lot of people do a lot of like intellectual dance music IDM stuff with live coding, and I don't fall in that camp too much. But with code, you can rely on things like randomness. You can apply a function that plays something 10 times as fast and then jumps to 100 times as fast and then chops it up in weird ways. And so there's many different things you can do with live coding, and like any other way of making music, whether it's with a DAW or if it's DAW-less or if it's live. It's just they're all perfectly valid. None of them are better than the others. I think that live coding is not going to be like the next DJs are not going to necessarily be live coders. I think that similar to our event, you might have some live coders doing something that's a very specific kind of music, and you might have a DJ playing at the end, and maybe some people in the audience won't even know the difference. Maybe some will, and will be able to be critical. But yeah, I think all different ways of making music are perfectly valid, and live coding is just one of those.
Cool. So we talked about how your journey went from electronic music into live coding, and I want to hear a bit more about the scene in New York. I mean, the electronic music scene in New York, since Output opened back in 2013 or so, has really exploded, especially in Brooklyn, Bushwick, and talk to us about how the live coding community developed out of that, and where it came from, where it's going.
Totally. Yeah, I would say, so live coding, the origins are more in the UK, actually. It's very much a like institutionalized, like, researchers are thinking, how can we use code to make music in new ways? And meanwhile, as you mentioned, Output, there's this whole like DIY electronic scene happening in New York. And the live coding scene in New York, I'm part of a group called Live Code NYC. It's this beautiful confluence of the two, where you have this influence coming from overseas, plus the existing DIY communities in New York. So a lot of what things looked like before, while there still were live shows, and now there's live streams, was doing shows in DIY spaces. At one point, Live Code NYC did a show for the New York Stock Exchange.
Wow. So
just like very random, different opportunities, and like any kind of performing artists, like if people want what you're doing, like the gigs can look like anything, but or you can have all different kinds of gigs. But what happens is that typically we'll be doing things in DIY spaces, and in New York, there's a very strong DIY community and different arts organizations, and a lot of the different organizations try to like feed back into each other and try to send funding in each other's ways to kind of keep the community going, keep the community alive.
Cool. We've talked about live coding for quite a while. How about we jump in and you'll show us some?
Yeah, sure. I guess first of all, let's throw on our headphones.
Sure.
I have my computer here in front of me, and I have Ableton Live here. And right now in Ableton, all I have is a synthesizer. I'm using the operator, and I have a drum kit. And what I'm going to be doing with the live coding is I'll be sending MIDI signals to Ableton.
Okay.
So let's just see. And so a lot of people here, you might be familiar with DAWs, you might be familiar with coding, you might be familiar with both. Typically with code, you'll write a file, and then let's say it's like a Python file, you'll interpret the whole file or execute some code. With live coding, we create different tools. This is a tool called Title Cycles that allows you to not have to compile anything and not have to run the whole program, but rather you can run line by line.
Cool.
So to do that, you'll bring the mouse over a certain line, and you can just execute one line. So let's see, this is a drum sound that's being sent. I'm sending MIDI signal 36, and when I hit enter, you might be able to hear that. Can you hear that? Okay, cool. So this is sending MIDI signal 36. In Ableton, you can see that that's just the kick drum going. And then we go back here, and then let's send 38. This is a rest, so we're gonna, title cycles is all around the different cycles that are happening. So everything that's in these parentheses, or sorry, these quotation marks is the cycle. So I can do 2 drum beats like this. So now it subdivides it into 2. We can do more, we can do 3. You can do some fun polyrhythm things, you can do 4. You can also do multiplication, and then we can do like a fun bass draw, or fun like drop, and then we go. Cool. And you can see like I can, even though it is clock-based, I can choose when the cycles change. So it's kind of like session view in Ableton when you go to the next one. But rather than the different session clips, I have lines of code. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
Cool. So let's stop everything. So hush is a command to do that. And so this next drum here is a snare drum. So if we go into Ableton, you can see that this is snares 38, so 36, 38. So go into here, and then let's just see what this one sounds like. So if we play both these at the same time, they're hitting, I think it's at like 105 BPM right now. I'm gonna add a rest so that this drum plays on the offbeat. There we go.
Cool. Starting to be a beat.
Yeah, we're getting there. Make my own little 808 drum machine. 42 is a hi-hat. And what we can do is we can now use functions to make it change. So I could do ×2 here, ×4, or we can also use this command called fast. So we'll say fast 4. We'll say fast 8. Cool. And then this is like a little stale. I mean, it sounds good and all, but let's add some randomness now. Let's add some randomness. So I'm going to say the gain is going to be 0.5. So now it's quieter. We can make it a little bit louder. This is just the volume. And rather than doing a number, let's do a function. So let's say I want the range of this to be between 0.4 and 1, and we'll say that's going to happen randomly. Cool. So you can kind of hear it.
Swing now.
Yeah. We got some variance going on. So next, in Ableton, I have the operator here. This is just a software synth. So let's send a note C3. And I'm using this thing called struct, which allows us to use Euclidean rhythms. Are you familiar with those?
No.
Okay, Euclidean rhythms, it's a way to, let me stop this real quick. I'm not able to speak about it very intelligently, but essentially there's white papers that go into like, what are the popular rhythms? How can we put 1 beat into 8? How can we put 3 beats into 8 in a musical way?
Yeah.
So rather than having it be equally subdivided 3 and 8, we can actually do kind of like a, well, maybe you can hear it and then you can tell me what kind of beat this is. So this is a synth sound. We can hear that. We'll bring the drum in. Let's do 2 and 8. That's going to subdivide it. If we did 3 and 8, we might think it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But instead it does this. And we have like a fun 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2.
Yeah, there's more of a pause after the last one.
Yeah, exactly. So so this is the bass. It's a C3. So let's bring in like a little bit of a lead synth maybe. So this one is going to hit once because we have Euclidean 1, 8. And then rather than just hitting the same note, we're going to use the randomness again. And we're going to choose either the bass, 3 half steps up, 5, 7 half steps, or 10. So if you know your like jazz theory or music theory, this would be the 1, the minor third, the 4th, the 5th, or the 7th.
Okay.
So let's see what that sounds like. Cool. And let's make this go 2 and 8. And we can go 3 and 8. 4. 5. I like this, and then you can actually say I want to offset it by 1.
Yeah.
And then we can actually say the first cycle I want to offset it by 1. The second time I'm going to offset it by 0. You might be able to hear that better if I do 3 and 8 still. So you hear they're together and then they're off. And it's all just part of like using this kind of pattern notation that's specific to title cycles to just do fun things with code. So what else can we do? Let's do 5 and 8 maybe. And we can make this one go back to 2. And we can say this times 2. We can bring this guy back in. We can say, we'll do 8. And we'll say sometimes, let's make it go twice as fast. I don't really like that. Let's say every 4, maybe? That kind of sounds pretty cool. And it's really just playing with it. And I don't do much modular stuff, but with modular, there's a lot of patch and tweaking, and the tweaking is where the fun parts happen. And here, it's like changing a number around and seeing kind of where you get to. Yeah, and we have like a little bit of a groove. I like this going back over there. Let's make a little bit of a different bass line. So I'm going to say, let's make the note go -4. You can hear that going. We can go up. And rather than me typing that in every time, let's just automate it. So we'll do -4, -2, 0. And these are again half steps. And then minor third. And I want that to go half as fast, so I'll divide that by 2. Cool, we got like a little groove going. Yeah, but a lot of it, so let me hush that real quick. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I would love to hear how you're doing the sound design. Is that happening in title cycles itself, or you're doing most of that in Ableton and building your own sample libraries?
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now, what I've been leaning towards recently is leaning on what Ableton's good at, which is using their kits, using their effects, using their synthesizers, and sending MIDI notes to Ableton. But you can actually do all this within, there's something called Super Collider, which is a synthesizer that Title Cycles talks to. And that's like its own open sourced synthesizer. And so I would say for people who are getting started, who don't want to use Ableton, that's a perfectly valid option. Title Cycles is excellent at working with samples. And right now everything's over MIDI. And so working with samples is really great because then you can apply a lot of these different patterns to the samples that you're using.
Yeah.
But other than that, I do a lot of sound design with my hardware synthesizer. So I'll be changing the filter cutoff. I like using a foot pedal to have some expression during sets, things like that.
Pretty cool. And why did you pick Title Cycles?
So I tried live coding maybe 4 years ago, and I picked a different tool that was really hard to set up. And I actually it didn't work at all for me. So I didn't do Title Cycles. I didn't do live coding for like 3 years after that. And then finally, I guess maybe a year and a half ago now, I was like, let me give live coding a try again. I'll try this new tool that people are talking about called Title Cycles. And the setup wasn't super easy, but I got it working within like maybe an hour and a half.
Okay.
And after that, it was just off to the races. Like my coding ability mixed with my music ability to make this really, and I just hit the ground running. And I remember I got it installed at like 3 p.m. and then I was up till 2 a.m. just playing around with this. So, yeah, and there are many different tools in the ecosystem of live coding for music. Another really popular tool that's a little easier to use getting started just because the install is a little more straightforward is something called Sonic Pi. You may have heard of that one before.
Yeah.
Cool. And there's a lot of open source things as well. Like people make their own libraries. Like you can make web-based live coding libraries. It's really just how can you make music with code? And I chose Title Cycles because it has this really interesting pattern notation that I like to use.
Cool. And did you have a long coding background prior to jumping in? Like, do you need to know how to code already to jump into live coding, or can you do it as a beginner?
You can totally do it as a beginner. I say this, not being a beginner coder. I have coded before.
Yeah.
I will say the hardest thing with Title Cycles is the installation process. But once you get it going, like, this is its own language. It's a Haskell-based language, but I've shown this to a lot of people who don't code. And when I start, typically I'll start my sets with a blank document. So everyone will be able to see the progression that happens. And you can see that if there's one bass drum going, and then there's two going, you can kind of see those changes. And then what else could I do? Well, let's just leave it at that for now. But so I'll say that you don't need to know how to code. I think that what helps is knowing how to navigate a text editor quickly. Like that helps you just be faster. It's kind of like having chops on the piano. It helps to
the muscle
practice.
memory.
Exactly.
Cool. So my last two questions for you. One, you're performing on Saturday night.
Yeah.
Tell us about your performance. What's your intent with it? What are you hoping to showcase?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think that I'm still deciding. There's a couple days left to figure it out. My sets are either completely improvised or I won't have anything going into it.
Okay.
But I think that I want to have it be a mix of more melodic, like leaning into my synthesizer. I've been having a lot of fun doing live looping with my voice, so I might be doing some voice stuff as well. But I want to try to have the goal, especially for this event, I think the context is always key for like, where am I performing? And I think for this audience, people who are curious about live coding, I'm going to try to make it more accessible. Okay. And I want to try to have the coding front and center, keep the code pretty terse, so that people can kind of follow along while it's happening. Yeah.
Cool. Very cool. We're excited to see it.
Yeah.
And what are your hopes and dreams as an artist? What are you hoping to create if you have any?
You can't just cram that in as the last question. It's a mean thing to do. No, I think for me as an artist, a lot of the music I make is for myself. And if other people also enjoy it, amazing. If it resonates with other people, great. What I like about live coding is that it catches two audiences. It resonates with the people who are coders, but maybe not musicians. And it resonates with the musicians who want to try to expand their practice and maybe involve coding. If I am trying to share my music and put it more outwards, I think it's always trying to have the intent be to build community and make connections, to meet new collaborators, perhaps, and to, I think with live coding especially, just inspire people to remind them that you can be creative with coding, and it's not always like this only for software engineering kind of thing. So, Yeah. So I could talk about that for many more hours or days. So that's my short answer.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for sharing about your story and teaching us a little bit about live coding.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, everyone. We'll hopefully see you Saturday, where you'll get to see Dan perform, our friend Idea on Sound, and I'll do a DJ set along with one of our other friends doing some visuals, live-coded visuals alongside the DJ set. So have a good day, and hope to see you Saturday.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.